In landscape painting, especially when approached from a psychological or perceptual angle, the goal isn't to replicate nature's every leaf or maybe a blade of grass, but to translate the impression of space, weight, rhythm, and particularly form. This approach leans into how the human brain perceives and organizes information by simplifying, grouping masses, and prioritizing. On my recent visit to the Art Gallery of Ontario, I sought out works that captured this very essence of simplified landscape painting. Pieces where vast open space, restrained brushwork, although sometimes maybe not so much, and minimal detail evoked more emotion than complexity ever could. Welcome back to my channel. I've been meaning to get into painting landscape works and incorporating them into my channel, and I thought, why not now? I've been getting questions and requests from some of you on here, and there's something deeply grounding about landscapes, I find, especially those that embrace simplicity and leave room for the imagination to wander. After, I think it's been probably 24 or so videos devoted to figure work and maybe more complex compositions, I've started to crave this quiet elegance and emotional depth that can come from certain pared down scenes. So let's explore how light and space and suggestion can sometimes speak louder than details, and how sometimes a single brushstroke or even an open area, open negative space as I call it, can evoke a sense of peace, memory, or even mood. So this shift into landscape work with these two studies that I'm putting out this week is somewhat a natural extension of the intuitive and experimental approach I teach on here and I try to share on this channel. So I'm excited to invite you into this new, I guess, journey that leans kind of into minimalism, abstraction and spiritual qualities of painting. I thought, what better way to find inspiration than to head out to the AGO, which is not too far from where I live, and to start with the group of seven, and namely Tom Thompson, who is probably best recognized and one of my favorite group of seven painters. Here I'm showing a few of his smaller works from Round Lake, Mud Bay, Bern County, Autumn Foliage, all of scenes that are very familiar to him. Northern lake scenes. Thompson had a way of distilling the landscape down to its most powerful elements. His paintings are not overly detailed or realistic. Instead, they focused on shape, rhythm, color, and atmosphere, like this particular piece that I'm zooming in on, called The West Wind. There's a kind of visual shorthand that Thompson uses in his brushwork here. You got thick, confident strokes and areas of flat color that evoke more than they describe. You almost feel the wind, and even the quietness, the isolation, and the grandeur of the tree, without being shown every leaf or ripple. Now on to my first of the two demos that I put out this week, which are both from imagination. They're very intuitive. I've painted a lot of landscapes in the past, and as you can see in the bottom right, there's not much detail, so I didn't necessarily need to reference much. What I did here, however, is try to channel some of those Tom Thompson's ideas into my own work and resist overworking the image. I've got essentially what translates to 3 or 4 planes. You got the foreground, you got the middle ground, which ultimately is void of any detail. It's just one cool color, blues, purples, grays, and then you have the mountain scene in the background. I've always been drawn to mountains ever since I was a kid, so conversely I've painted them a lot in the past, but not in the last few years, however. So doing this whole landscape collection for YouTube is definitely refreshing and welcoming, and an excuse really to do them, because a lot of the work that I do now, the commission work, and as I said, the work that I've put out has mostly been figurative. So my focus for this particular piece is, as I said, to minimize the overall aesthetic. Instead, let the broad shapes, loose marks, and negative space do the quote-unquote heavy lifting. I'm using mostly palette knife and a squeegee brush, which if you followed me in the past here, you know exactly how I use that guy. But for the foreground, I've chosen to apply paint with a brush, both from a perspective of balance, and also I like the aesthetic, the visceral, textural impasto qualities that you can only really attain with a brush, as you can see there in the close-up image here. Now, the other thing that's also very pertinent, and of course with landscape painting, a lot of you people know this, things that are closer are going to be much sharper and much more chromatic. So color plays a vital role. Let me show you an example from the AGO where it is a defining role of a painting. Looking at this William Blair Bruce's landscape with poppies, it reminded me that painting a landscape isn't about showing what you see, only that at least, but about expressing how it feels to be there, with clarity, courage, and a touch of spontaneity or color, that vibrant red that he's got there on his painting. So this foreground section of my work here, as I said, is getting a lot of brush treatment. There is indication of form with the brush. So the brush serves obviously a dual purpose. I like the aesthetic feel and look of a brush mark, but it actually indicates grass or field by the way that I'm dragging the brush up to down. It's got obviously textural qualities, and it pairs well. There's a juxtaposition with the middle ground, which, as you can see there, is all chiseled. It's been applied with a squeegee brush and a palette knife. Now, just like that work that I just showed with the poppy fields, I'm coming in with much more of a chromatic, sort of like a color punch for this piece. As the eye comes in closer, you'll have these higher chroma reds, indicating, I'm not sure, to be honest, what. It's just a higher chroma. It needed a bit more of a color note for the front of the painting, and it was added on. Let's see what we came up with this about a 1 hour Alla Prima demo. It certainly shares some of the qualities from the Tom Thompson pieces, but I thought for this next demo I'd push things even further and further explore this psychology of perception and big masses and our painter's way of seeing things. So with that in mind, let's head back to the AGO and look at this installation of Aboriginal work, which is very much stylized, very 2D. It is driven by color and design exclusively, and I found it quite intriguing. I'm inspired by a lot of things, some that even are a mystery as to why. For this second demo, beside some of the pieces from the AGO, I was inspired by Charles Hawthorne's teachings, particularly in his book Hawthorne on Painting, a book I highly recommend, by the way. He emphasizes in it, strongly emphasizing seeing and painting in planes. So focusing on large, simplified shapes of color and value. Actually, it's just color. If you have color right, value is always going to be right. We'd always, as teachers, emphasize color and value to emphasize what color we're referring to, but color is ultimately the only thing that matters. But he emphasizes color values, simplifying them, I should say, rather than chasing details. So For this demo, I'm starting off with cold wax medium mixed with oil paint. I've done a few demos on using cold wax. I'm not getting into too many details with regards to materials here, except to say that I'm using it at around 50% ratio cold wax to paint here. And I'm indicating intuitive planes. Again, this landscape is entirely from imagination. I'm indicating foreground, which is a bit darker, middle ground, which is, as all of these planes are, under paintings for the top layers. And again, I'm indicating form, I'm indicating shape, I'm seeing how it reads to me with regards to the substrate, and I'm indicating the furthest most point or some of the distant hills there. So back to Charles's teachings. I in fact don't have his book in front of me right now, it's somewhere else, but I've read it enough times to remember most of the pertinent points. So again, you got to see the big masses first. Always start by observing the large masses, simple shapes of color, and avoid getting caught up in details too early. Now, this video is about simplifying your landscapes. I don't have anything against details. In fact, I like details. And I've done many landscapes with details. I use them sporadically, however. For these demos, for this particular demo and the one previous to it, I didn't get into any details for the most part, although those distant hills did get a bit more work with regards to the trees. But the second point that Charles Hawthorne used to teach is that color is relative. Color relationships matter more than the accuracy of individual color. It's how the color sits next to each other that creates the form of light. And one of the ways that you can do this is definitely going to take a lot of practice, and that is to paint what you see and not what you know. So essentially what that tells you is to suppress symbolic thinking, like, oh, I'm painting a tree, or if you're painting figurative work, oh, this is an eye. Instead, focus on the abstract shapes of light and shadow. And light creates form, essentially. Think of a form as a series of color value planes turning in space based on how the light hits them. So, I mean, it's easy to sort of comprehend, but it takes many years to sort of master. As I'm putting in that background underpainting for the sky, it is also quite important, and this goes back to Charles's teaching, work with a full brush. So use thick, deliberate strokes of correct color. Here I'm using a squeegee, a wide squeegee. I don't know if that's a brush or just a tool. So use thick strokes of correct color and value. Avoid overblending or quote-unquote licking the paint, as some painters call them. Here you can see I'm coming in with the top color, again 50% cold wax, with this cool blue. So the underpainting that I've applied was obviously strategic. It is on the warmer side. Here I've got the shadow, which is, it reads as very cool, even though it's a warmer gray. And I'm scratching into it very lightly with this tool, which has got this, I don't know, it's called AstroTurf, I believe, underneath it, and it's basically creating interesting marks that I want for that foreground. For me, as you can already ascertain from the previous videos, mark making is very pertinent, very important. So whatever marks you need to make or communicate, use the appropriate tool. It serves no one for you to have, extremely expensive brushes if you're unable to communicate what it is that you want to communicate with that expensive brush. So whether it's that AstroTurf tool or a squeegee or this wide squeegee brush, use the right tool for the job. As you can see from the finished study on the right, this is a very flat painting. It doesn't have too much rendering of the planes. You've got the sun coming in over the hill. You got the shadow part that's most of 70% of this painting. I'm now trying to render some of the distant hill and some of the forms of those trees, which kind of act as some sort of anchors for this piece. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the trees on the left. Again, remember, this is all from intuition and imagination, so I'm sure if there was a reference that I was working off of, like plein air, which by the way I plan on getting into for this channel as well in the near future, or maybe a photograph, you can certainly take some of these fundamental concepts and work this painting as much as you'd like. But I wanted to put out these two initial demos as an introduction of sorts to this intuitive landscape series, which I hope to compile here, because they lay the groundwork for a way of seeing that's absolutely fundamental to all form of landscape painting. So before we get into more complex scenes, which I may likely even do next week, it's important to shift how we perceive the landscape. So not as a collection of individual objects or intricate details, but a connected web of large masses, shapes, and rhythms. I'm keen on hearing your thoughts about this style of painting, especially because it invites such a different way of engaging with the landscape. Does it resonate with how you approach your own landscape painting? My intention, of course, with YouTube all along has been to educate, but also to share some of my work. So in getting some of the feedback from you guys, I can kind of gauge as to what direction to go. I plan on making more, of course, landscape pieces for here, but it gives me some insight as to what subject matter to sort of present and what subjects in particular to teach, or what concepts should I cover more in depth. As I finish this short second study, I will leave you with some best practices in ways you can simplify your landscape work. So firstly, you've got to squint to simplify values. So squinting collapses the value structure of a landscape into essential lights and darks. Secondly, block in with confidence. Use large brushes, palette knives, or even brayers. Thirdly, group values. So instead of seeing, countless kinds of greens, for example, in a forest, group them into 2 or 3 broad zones of dark, middle, and light. You've got to abstract the space. Don't aim to copy the scene. Translate it. You're mapping visual weight and movement, not literal trees and hills. Lastly, you got to use edges as mood. We didn't get into edges for this video, but soften or sharpen edges depending on where you want your tension or calmness to go. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. I will see you next week, and to everybody, happy and blessed and joyous Easter holiday. Bye-bye.